In the early 1990s, I was just a 21-year-old living about 35 minutes drive from Manchester. My life was a mess with no direction. My 3-year relationship with my girlfriend had just ended, leaving me adrift like a leaf blown by the wind, with no place to anchor. We had thought that our love would last forever, but harsh reality proved otherwise. She walked out of my life, taking with her all the hopes and plans I had for the future. The following days, I fell into a vague void, not knowing what to do, where to go, or how to start over. I live in a small, lonely house in a quiet suburb where everything seems to stand still. My life seems to be stuck in an endless loop. Day after day, I go to a boring job, come home to dinner alone, and then sit and watch the TV with its flickering lights. Sometimes, I feel like a stranded ship, silently rotting in the middle of a silent ocean. Things began to change when my grandmother intervened in my life. She was a strong, devout woman who believed in God. After my grandfather passed away, she went to church every Sunday. I had never been a very religious person, but to make her happy, I decided to go with her every week. At first, it was just an act of duty, but gradually, I realized that those hours in church gave me a rare sense of peace. Watching my grandmother sit quietly praying with her thin hands clasped together, I felt something about her faith that drew me in. She often told me that God has a plan for everyone, and suffering is a part of that. I'm not sure I fully believed it, but at least those words helped me find some grounding in my uncertain days. Then one day, after church, I met her, Tiffany. It was a gloomy Sunday morning, the weak sunlight filtering through the colorful stained glass windows on the church ceiling. I was about to leave with my grandmother when my eyes fell on her. She stood near the back row, looking completely different from everyone else in the small community. Her face was strangely beautiful. Her black hair was curly. Her hazel eyes were mysterious. In that moment, it seemed like all the surrounding sounds had disappeared. I only saw her, and all my senses were drawn to her. I waited until the service was over, then mustered up the courage to approach her. It was the first time in months that I felt my heart beat so fast. When I spoke, she smiled, a soft yet captivating smile. She introduced herself as Tiffany and said she had just moved to the area to attend college. Her sudden appearance made me curious, since this was not the ideal place for young people. But the charm in the way she spoke made me forget all the questions in my mind. We talked for a while, exchanged phone numbers, and I left the church in a strange state of euphoria. We texted every day that week. Tiffany told me a little about her life, but she was very reserved. She said her family had just moved here to get away from a troubled biological father and an alcoholic stepfather. I could sense the sadness behind her words, but she always managed to deflect the conversation with light jokes, making me feel like things were getting back on track. I didn't want to push her to open up more because I knew some wounds needed time to heal. When we met again at church the following Sunday, I decided to ask her out. Tiffany accepted without hesitation, and we planned a simple date for the following week. All week long, I couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something about Tiffany that drew me in, a strange combination of vulnerability and mystery. I used to think that strange things only happened in books and movies. Thrilling stories about ghosts and the paranormal were always something I was skeptical about. But that night, all my preconceptions were erased. That was the night I met the darkness. Not the darkness out there, but the darkness that lived, breathed, and stared into my soul. Our first date was one I will never forget. Before everything happened, our date was pretty normal. Tiffany and I watched a romantic comedy. She smiled softly, but I could sense a deep sadness in her eyes. Afterwards, we went to a small restaurant on the edge of town. This restaurant is not a special place, but it has a cozy feeling. We chose a small table near the window. Through the glass, the yellow streetlights cast a rare peaceful scene on the wet road due to the afternoon rain. Tiffany asked me a lot of questions about my family, my life, and even the dreams I had never told anyone. Each question was designed to touch the deepest corners of my soul. And when I answered, her hazel eyes lit up in a strange way. They seemed to absorb every word I said, every emotion I expressed. After dinner, I offered to take her for a drive. At first, she hesitated, but then she nodded, smiling mysteriously. Journey in the dark. We left town and drove down a small road along the edge of the forest. It was a road I often took when I needed some quiet time to think. There was no moon that night, and the light from the car headlights was the only source of light to break the darkness. The trees on both sides of the road swayed in the wind, making a rustling sound like someone whispering. Tiffany was silent the whole way, which was strange to me. She was usually the one to initiate conversations. I turned to ask her if she was okay. She didn't answer right away, just looked out the window with a distant gaze. After a while, she spoke, but her voice was different. It wasn't as warm and gentle as before. "Do you believe in fate?" Tiffany asked, her eyes still turned outward. "I guess so, but I never thought it had anything to do with anything so supernatural," I replied, confusion starting to creep in. She was silent for a long moment, then spoke again, but this time her voice had changed completely. It was deep and cold, unlike any voice I had ever heard. The words that came out were not English or any language I knew. It was ancient, with an eerie timbre, as if each sound carried the weight of 1,000 years of history. The transformation. I turned to Tiffany, trying to ask if she was okay, but before I could open my mouth, she lifted her head, and I saw it. Her eyes were no longer hazel. Instead, they were white, without irises, like eyes that had lost their life. A cold feeling spread through my body. She began to mumble strange words, so fast that I couldn't understand them. Her voice echoed in the car, as if amplified by some invisible force. The air in the car seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. I panicked. My steering wheel shook as I tried to keep my composure. "Tiffany, are you okay?" I yelled, but she didn't answer. Suddenly, she laughed, a high-pitched laugh that sent a chill down my spine. Then, abruptly, she opened the car door while it was still moving and jumped out in a frenzy. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded down the road, the tires screeching. I ran out, but she was gone in the dense darkness of the forest. Trying to find her, I stood there, screaming her name in vain. The wind blew through the trees, carrying a rustling sound like a warning. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but then I hesitated. Would they believe me? I got back in the car and sat motionless for an hour, waiting for her to return. But Tiffany was gone, without a trace. The next day, I went to the church, hoping someone would know her. But no one remembered meeting her. The church administrator even confirmed that no one named Tiffany had attended the service that day. I tried to find the phone number she had given me, but it didn't exist. Every trace of Tiffany, including any social media accounts I had seen, had been erased. The days that followed. From that night on, I was no longer myself. I stayed away from the woods, away from that road. But the images of Tiffany still haunted me. I could not forget her white eyes, her strange voice, and the laughter that echoed in the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, on the side of the road, looking at me with eyes that did not belong to this world. I didn't know who Tiffany really was, or what had happened to her, but deep down, I felt like I had accidentally stepped into a part of the world that I shouldn't have. And to this day, I still wonder, did she really exist? Or was she just a wandering spirit, here to bring me into her own story? Nevada, summer 2010. A scorching land where the sun beats down on the dry land, drawing endless stretches of sand. The desert here is unlike any I have ever seen. It is both empty and dark, and seems to contain some mysterious power. In my mind, it is a place where time stands still, where every wind that blows seems to whisper ancient stories. This trip, I believed, would be a special one, an adventure of a lifetime. I drove my family's old Volkswagen, a car one jokingly called the monster that never died. Despite a million problems, from a weak engine to broken brakes to electronics that rarely worked, it still drove steadily on the dusty roads. My parents waited for the day it would break down so they could have an excuse to buy a new car. But as if it were defying the world, the Volkswagen persisted, as if it were tied to my fate. My journey began with a crazy idea to drive alone through remote lands to visit Louis, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. Louis lived a few states away, and the Nevada desert lay between us. For me, driving through empty lands under a cloudless blue sky was something so freeing, so serene. The first few days of the trip were wonderful. I drove through lush green valleys, over high mountains, and felt the breath of the land. Louis and I had a great time together. We drank beer, laughed, and told old stories. It was a memorable time. But what I didn't know was that the return trip would bring me closer to fear than I had ever experienced. It was early and the air was crisp when I left Louis' house. I drove, feeling the tires roll across the hot asphalt. Everything seemed peaceful until I reached the middle of the Nevada desert. The storm came suddenly. At first, it was just gray clouds appearing on the horizon. Then gradually, they merged into a gloomy curtain covering the sky. Rain began to fall, each large drop hitting the windshield, as if trying to penetrate the fragile glass. The problem was, the Volkswagen's wipers had long since broken. Even a light drizzle was enough to obscure visibility, let alone a downpour. I had no choice but to pull over, turn off the engine, and wait out the storm. I parked far enough away from the road, almost in the desert, to avoid the risk of being hit by passing trucks. The storm was getting stronger, thunder rumbling everywhere. The car became a small cage in a wild and dangerous world. Time passed slowly. I tried to think of happy things to distract myself from the anxiety, but the silence and darkness outside made me uneasy. The desert was not just empty, it seemed to be lurking, waiting. Then I sensed something was wrong. The storm had subsided, but a strange feeling began to rise within me. A strange urge, almost instinctive, told me to leave the car immediately. But how could I leave? Out there was a thick darkness, no light, nothing but the howling of the wind through the distant ravines. As I tried to calm myself, a bright flash of light appeared in the darkness. It wasn't lightning, but light, a flashlight beam, moving strangely back and forth. I looked closer and realized it wasn't coming from just one source. 3 figures appeared. They moved toward my car, each holding a flashlight, the light dancing wildly in the darkness. They surrounded the car, shining the light into every corner, as if searching for something. Panic surged through me. I didn't know who they were, but their appearance in the dark desert night couldn't be a good thing. I pressed my back against the large rock, trying to hide myself in the darkness of the night. My heart was pounding like a drum being beaten repeatedly, each beat reverberating in my chest. I didn't dare move, even holding my breath to keep everything as quiet as possible. Up ahead, 3 figures were approaching my car, walking slowly but surely, like predators closing in on their prey. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but what I saw was enough to send a chill down my spine. They held flashlights, waving them in strange arcs, as if they were trying to send a signal or perform some mysterious ritual. The light from the flashlights flickered, illuminating the space around them, sometimes shining over my hiding spot, making me want to cower. One of the 3, the leader it seemed, was taller and more muscular. He walked straight toward my car, stopping right next to the door. His flashlight traced a long path along the body of the car, the light reflecting off the faded paint of the old Volkswagen. I followed the light, my heart sinking into my stomach at the thought of them searching the car and finding what I had hidden inside. The second, smaller man stepped up beside the leader. He pulled something out of his pocket, what looked like a large pair of pliers. I tried to see better in the dim light, and a feeling of dread immediately gripped me. He leaned down near the car door and began to fiddle with the lock. The third man stood slightly back, holding a gun in his hand. I saw him lift the gun, turn it slightly in his hand, his eyes cold as if calculating something. Then suddenly, he raised the gun high into the air and shouted something in an unknown language. Bang! The gunshot rang out, tearing apart the quiet night. The sharp sound made me jump, my body tense like a guitar string. Unable to control myself, I bit my lip hard. The pain was so intense that blood flowed into my mouth. The salty taste quickly spread across my tongue. I put my hand to my mouth, trying to stop myself from making any noise. But the pain from the cut on my lip only made me more alert, enough to take in my surroundings more clearly. The three of them continued to move, flashlight beams dancing around the car, occasionally scanning the surrounding bushes, as if they were searching for something or someone. The gunman turned to look at the other two, saying something in a low voice that I couldn't make out. The three of them nodded to each other, then continued to scan the area around the car. A strong wind blew, rustling the leaves and sending grains of sand flying into the air. I pressed myself against the rock, trying to hide as much as possible. In that moment, I felt a terrible fear flood through me. They were not random passers-by. Their actions, their eyes, their aggression all said they had a purpose. I began to wonder, who were they? What did they want from me? A loud noise broke me out of my thoughts. The small figure was trying to open the car door, using a pair of pliers to pry the lock. The door made a slight screech, and I knew that time was running out. If they got inside, they would find everything. What should I do? Run away? Or stand up and face it? Confused thoughts ran through my head, but my body was frozen, unable to lift a finger. I just sat there, holding my breath, listening to every sound, waiting for something, a miracle, or a chance to escape. And all the while, the sound of the gunshot echoed in my head, a haunting warning that I could not escape this situation easily. Salvation. The police car's lights flashed in the rain, the dazzling flashing light tearing apart the dark night. I took a deep breath. My legs, which had been numb from sitting for so long, now ran like crazy towards that light of salvation. The rain was heavy, pattering on my already soaked jacket, but I didn't pay any attention. My rapid breathing mixed with the sound of the rain, creating a chaotic sound that my ears could no longer distinguish. I waved frantically, my hands shaking as if afraid that if I didn't signal in time, the police car would drive away and leave me alone to face these dangerous men. "Hey, over here! Please stop!" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the rumble of thunder. I almost stumbled as my feet slipped on the mud, but the need to help kept me on my feet. The police car's headlights illuminated everything, sweeping across the deserted field and the area around my Volkswagen. I glanced quickly at the three figures. They stood there, motionless for a few seconds, as if surprised by the police car's presence. Their flashlights flickered in and out in a chaotic manner, as if they were overshadowed by the police car's powerful light. Then, suddenly, they were gone, as if melting into the darkness. I had no idea where they were going, only their silhouettes blurred in the heavy rain. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in my head, but now the sight of the police car brought a glimmer of hope. The police car stopped, lights still flashing. I rushed closer, soaking wet and mud on my shoes. The door opened, and two policemen got out. One was a stern-faced middle-aged man. The other was younger, looking like a rookie. "Who are you? What happened here?" the older cop asked, his eyes scanning me. "Three men. They have guns. They were just here, near my car," I stammered, pointing at the Volkswagen. My rapid breathing made my voice crack, but my frightened eyes and shaking body probably said it all. The young cop turned on his flashlight and scanned the area. "Nobody there," he said, sounding slightly confused. "They were just here." I insisted, my despair rising as I saw the young cop's suspicious face. "They have guns, and they're trying to break into my car." The older cop nodded, signaling his comrades. "Check around. They can't have gone far." The younger cop quickly drew his gun, and headed toward the nearby bushes, his flashlight searching frantically. Meanwhile, the older cop turned to me. "Are you sure you're not seeing things? With this heavy rain, sometimes your eyes can deceive you." "I'm not mistaken," I almost shouted. "They're here, and they have guns." One of them fired into the air. The policeman looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He pulled out his walkie-talkie, calling for backup. "We'll check, but you stay here. Don't go anywhere." I nodded, my legs barely able to support me. I leaned against a nearby tree, trying to catch my breath. In the darkness, I could still feel the presence of strangers, as if they were lurking somewhere, waiting for a chance to return. But at least I wasn't alone anymore. Flashlights and police car lights continued to sweep through the night, searching for any trace of the strangers. I was still trembling with fear, but there was also a glimmer of hope that, finally, everything would be resolved.